More than 200 opposition politicians and protesters have been arrested in recent days after Senegalese President Macky Sall postponed this month's election. At least one private television channel has had their broadcasting license revoked after they aired footage of protests on Sunday. The government also shut down internet access via mobile data.
Across the
Opposition
world.
protesters have accused Sall of attempting to stage a coup by extending his term in office. Earlier this week, lawmakers voted to postpone the elections until December. Back in the United States, the former head of Honduras's national police pleaded guilty Tuesday to cocaine trafficking charges. Juan Carlos El Tigre Bonilla appeared in a New York City court just days before he was scheduled to go on trial with former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez. Speculation is growing that Bonilla will now testify against Hernandez. The two were extradited to the United States in 2022. Hernandez was arrested in February 2022, less than a month after his presidential term ended. He was a longtime U.S. ally who received backing during his entire 8-year term despite mounting reports of serious human rights violations and accusations of corruption and involvement with drug smuggling. His brother, Juan Antonio Tony Hernandez, is currently serving a life prison sentence in the U.S. after being convicted in 2019 of smuggling cocaine. In Chile, the death toll from devastating wildfires has increased to over 120, while hundreds of people are still missing. Thousands of homes were charred and entire neighborhoods decimated after the blazes broke out last week in Chile's central coastal hills. The seaside cities of Viña del Mar and Valparaiso have been engulfed with smoke for days, and volunteers continue to search for survivors. These are the deadliest ever wildfires to hit Chile due to record heat. In more news from Chile, former President Sebastián Piñera died Tuesday in a helicopter crash. He first served from 2010 to 2014 and again from 2018 to 2022. Massive protests broke out against Piñera's government in 2019 due to rising inequality, high cost of living, and privatization. He responded by unleashing Chile's police force and military, both of which were accused of severe human rights violations, including beating and torturing demonstrators. Funeral arrangements are being planned for Namibian President Hage Tuesday night envisions 3 phases of 45 days each. In the first phase, Hamas would release all female Israeli hostages, males under 19, and elderly and sick people in exchange for Palestinian women and children held in Israeli jails. Israel would also withdraw from populated areas in Gaza, cease aerial operations, allow far more aid to enter, and permit Palestinians to return to their homes, including in northern Gaza. The second 45-day phase, to be negotiated during the first, would include the release of all remaining hostages, mostly soldiers, in exchange for more Palestinian prisoners, and Israel would complete its withdrawal from Gaza. In the third phase, the sides would exchange the remains of hostages and prisoners. President Biden commented on Hamas's counterproposal on Tuesday, calling it, quote, a little over the top.
There is some movement, and I don't want to, I'll maybe choose my words. There's some movement. There's been a response from there's been a response from the opposition, but yes, I'm sorry, from Hamas, but it seems to be a little over the top. We're not sure where it is. There's a continuing negotiation right now.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in Israel overnight after meetings on Tuesday in Egypt and Qatar. He will meet with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Isaac Herzog, among others, to discuss Hamas's response to the proposed deal. Blinken will also meet Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas later today. As the negotiations continue, Israel's assault on Gaza is entering its 5th month. Over 27,500 Palestinians have been killed and nearly 67,000 wounded since October 7th. While the vast majority of Gaza's population have been driven from their homes, much of the territory has been destroyed or severely damaged, and a quarter of the population is facing starvation. For more on the ceasefire negotiations, we're joined by Daniel Levy, president of the U.S. Middle East Project and a former former Israeli peace negotiator under Prime Ministers Ehud Barak and Yitzhak Rabin. Daniel Levy, welcome to Democracy Now! If we could just begin with your assessment of the negotiations, how they've been proceeding so far, and what you anticipate Israel's response might be to the counterproposal offered by Hamas.
Well, we do now have a detailed position that has been put out in the public domain. You referenced that. I think a crucial thing to say about this is that what Hamas have said is that it's not that we can do phase one, move on to phase two, move on to phase three, is that there has to be an agreement up front that this is going to deliver a final ceasefire. Now, we've heard not detailed counter proposals from the Israeli side. We don't have that. What we have heard is Prime Minister Netanyahu making clear that he will not accept a permanent ceasefire. He will not redeploy his troops out of Gaza, and has also been circumspect on what kind of Israeli prisoner exchange would be on the table. That suggests that the parties are still really quite some distance apart, that there's an element of blame game not being attributed with blame, and there's an element of where more could one take the negotiations. I think, Nermeen, that will be partly dependent on three factors. Firstly, the balance of forces on the battlefield. This has not gone as Israel had anticipated, as Israel had hoped, as Israel's maximalist war claims had set out. Israel is, yes, operating Gaza. We've seen the terrible destruction. You've gone through that, the level of death, of civilian death, of child death, the disease and starvation now. But we are not seeing Hamas's resilience wane. So on the battlefield, that is still something of a stalemate. The second vector is internal pressure. Now, there is internal pressure inside Israel from the families. There are some inside the war cabinet who have said this needs to change direction. The third vector, and here's where we get to the Blinken visit, Nermeen. The third vector is, what are the external dynamics of pressure? We have had what South Africa has done at the International Court of Justice, which I think was very significant. What we do not have is an American Secretary of State empowered to use leverage to put on the table a disincentive, a cost structure for Israel to continue this. And therefore, I think we're stuck. What you instead have, curiously perhaps, is an attempt to almost do an end run and to tie in post-war plans with the ceasefire. Now, that could be a good thing, right? This didn't begin on October 7th, 4 months ago today. There are root causes that absolutely need to be addressed if Palestinians or Israelis are going to have security in the future. But Blinken seems to be putting on the table some pretty magical thinking, which has partly been set out in articles by Tom Friedman and David Ignatius, and I think are going to cause more problems, and maybe that's something we can touch on.
And Daniel Levy, if you can talk about the role of Qatar, the role of Egypt in these negotiations. Right now, Blinken is meeting with Netanyahu. And what ideally, and you as a negotiator know the significance of negotiations, Blinken needs to say to Netanyahu, while Blinken has continually said he's heartbroken and gut-wrenched over the fatalities in Gaza, what he's continued to do is provide weapons to Israel and run around Congress twice to ensure artillery shells go to them. So whatever he feels or says he is feeling, the significance of what the U.S. is doing in shoring up Netanyahu.
That is crucial, Amy, because some may have heard the president say, well, it seems like the Hamas position is a little too much. Some may consider the provision of 2,000-pound bombs by the U.S. to Israel after everything we've seen a little too much. Some may consider that when there is a plausible case for genocide at the International Court of Justice and you're ignoring those provisional measures a little too much. So what we have is a Qatari and Egyptian party, because there are no direct negotiations with Israel, between Israel and Hamas. So you have the mediators from the region who are talking to Hamas. They can try and lean on Hamas. If Hamas does not feel that it has to concede further. It will not. The question is, as you have noted, will the US lean on Israel? Now, it seems that rather than coming and saying there's a cost for you to do this, what Secretary Blinken is attempting to do is say, you know what, I'm going to reward you. You know what I've got in my back pocket? I've got Saudi normalization. Now, the Saudis have poured some cold water on this in a statement that they issued overnight to contradict something that spokesman Kirby said. But Blinken is hoping that this could somehow push a deal over the line. I think this demonstrates, first of all, naivety. We've had normalization with the UAE and others in the past, and it only encouraged Israeli extremism. It's layers and layers of make-believe. The idea that you can have Western-appointed Palestinian technocratic leaders somehow run the Palestinian side with no credibility on their own people. These limited measures against Israeli settlers that the administration took, when the problem is not a few bad apples. The problem is the state structure of occupation and oppression. So it seems that there's another effort here by the administration to say, we can stop ethnic cleansing, we can stop this displacement, but, and here's one of the big problems, I think, what is on offer is not Palestinian statehood. It's not that anyone is saying Israel will withdraw, the army will be out. You'll have recognition of a viable state that's actually going to exist with Jerusalem as its capital. Then we can deal with refugees and other things. What is apparently on offer is a little bit of verbiage in exchange for Saudi normalization. And what this is really, Amy, is this is an attempt to re-entrench, to refreeze the existence of a Bantustan and the use of partition as a tool of violence in ensuring a future of apartheid. And I think that's a pernicious thing to offer Palestinians. You can either have ethnic cleansing or apartheid, because what is not on the table is justice or genuine peace. And to be quite honest, if the US administration wants to make a deal with the Saudis to export more arms, maybe have some companies do well over a civilian energy program, as a geopolitical move to try and slow down de-dollarization, don't pretend that this is a peace move to end the horrors in Gaza, because this is a geopolitical maneuver, not a genocide avoidance maneuver.
And what about the role of Qatar and Egypt in this? And how you feel this is going to play out in the midst of these so-called negotiations that are coming close to yet another, Blinken won't use the word ceasefire, he talks about pause. The threat of a ground invasion of Rafah, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have fled. Something like 2 million Palestinians are there just on the tip of Gaza and the Egyptian border.
Well, as you say, Palestinians have been moved from one location to the other, and then every time the area they're told to move to, that becomes bombed. That's the story with Khan Yunis today. That's the story with Rafah tomorrow. Qatar can and has, and we saw the first pause and we saw releases, so this magical thinking that there's a non-negotiated path to saving the hostages, unfortunately those numbers are smaller than was previously talked about. There is a negotiated path, but Qatar and Egypt can only work with what they have from the Israeli side, and if they have something that is woefully falling short of what is needed, because on the Israeli side there is division, there's an unwillingness to make those hard decisions, they are not going to be able to deliver on the back of that. Now, Egypt has another concern, which is that Israel still hopes and holds a plan for the mass displacement of Palestinians in Gaza into Egypt, given the horrendous conditions there. And if Israel takes over the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, I think that exacerbates those concerns. You've had Egypt make statements to the effect of that not being something that can happen as far as they are concerned. So you have the role of the mediators. Perhaps what Netanyahu is hoping is that he can get some of the hostages out, because there is pressure, without having to concede on the other issues. So perhaps they're hoping that phase one happens. I don't think it's going to happen at that low cost. What what the Americans seem to hope is that they can drive a wedge between Netanyahu, Smotrich, and Ben-Gvir, and that Netanyahu, if faced with the opportunity, for instance, of a deal with Saudi Arabia, will not be able to stand down public pressure. I think this is more American naivety, American failure to learn the lessons of history, because I think Netanyahu will turn around and say, I can get a better deal, maybe not now, maybe not with this president, but look, I got those Abraham Accord deals while giving nothing, and I'll get something this time. So again, what does it boil down to?
While
It boils down to
while murdering
this administration,
the population of
this
Palestinian people.
president actually wants to create circumstances in which Israel has hard choices to make, in which genuine American leverage is on the table. If not, we'll continue to depend on battlefield dynamics, which aren't going well, on Israeli internal pressure, and we
Crime
risk
against
further
humanity.
regional escalation, which has gone up again
Crime
in the
against
last weeks.
humanity.
And America is apparently willing to risk being further entangled yet again in Middle East wars because it is unwilling to stare down an Israeli leader who has his own political survival at stake. Perhaps that's true for the president here as well, and who is insistent on maintaining his apartheid regime.
Well, Daniel Levy, I want to go back to a comment that you made about Saudi Arabia, the normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel being one of the principal incentives being offered. But there are also questions being raised, which I'm sure the Saudis are aware
Same
of,
as Bota.
that the U.S. promises to Saudi
Bota
Arabia
did in South
are not
Africa.
likely to be accepted
When the
by
Dutch
Congress,
went into South
even if
Africa
this
doing the
goes
same
ahead,
garbage for
including a
years.
defense pact as well as technical
South
support
Africa, remember.
to Saudi Arabia to develop a nuclear power industry.
Look it up.
And it's also unclear, as
Look
has
it
been
up.
reported, that Netanyahu
Netanyahu
sees Saudi
and
normalization
these people
and the
calling
continuation
themselves this
of
made-up
U.S.
name,
support
Israel,
as essential to his
invaded the
survival.
spot
I
and
don't
did that.
know if you agree with that.
some
Do you think that's true?
religious
Since it does seem
premise.
clear that his principal objective, to Netanyahu's, for reasons that we've covered on the show, his principal aim is to remain in power.
Excuse me?
Prime Minister Netanyahu is a leader who now has the legacy of October 7th hanging over him. In court, facing criminal charges. Can you still hear me?
Go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you. He is therefore making a daily calculation of how does he keep this going. Now, right now, it is more important for him to maintain his coalition rather than to go on this journey to Saudi normalization, something he wants, but not at any cost. And as I have said, he can turn around to the Israeli public and say, don't worry, the Americans want me to give up things which are too much for Israel to give up. My parliamentary opponents are willing to give them up, but not me. I will get a better deal. So that's on the Netanyahu side of things. He does not feel that he is in a corner yet. On the Saudi side of things, the Saudis, of course, why not? If you're in their position, say, let's see what more we can get from the Americans. Let's see what more they will put on the table. If there's enough on the table, maybe there are circumstances under which we will do this. And if not, at least we've already now got an American offer which we can use in the future and see where else this can go. So what you have is an Israeli side quite effective at playing the administration, a Saudi side quite effective at playing the administration, and I don't take joy in saying this, but a very weak, very ineffective, and self-harming government in Washington, D.C.
Daniel Levy, I want to go back to something you said. You referred to an apartheid regime being the Israeli government. You also talked about the Bantustan. Now, this is very significant given who you are. Former Israeli peace negotiator under Prime Minister Ehud Barak, as well as Yitzhak Rabin, will remind people, was killed by a Jewish extremist who was assassinated. explain what you mean by Bantustan, and then talk about where you see this going and how painful it was to see President Biden yesterday. He couldn't remember the name Hamas, really cognitively stumbling there, but then saying Hamas's proposal is over the top.
Look, on that latter point, I can't comment on. Oh, I can comment, but I have no special insight into the decision making that has a reality in this country, where that is the nature of the candidate being put forward. I imagine, and my assessment would be that that community of people, a sizable community, who see a significant, massive importance in an outcome in the election in which Donald Trump does not return to the White House, I imagine they would see it as crucial that everything be done so that the alternative to Trump is a president who is someone as broad a coalition